Hi, in this lesson, we're going to be learning about functions in Python. Now, functions help us to achieve two very important things in coding. Firstly, they help us to modularize our code. Okay, so instead of thinking or looking at our code as starting from line 1 all the way down to the last line, we are actually going to break it up into modules, okay, which we call functions, and they also help us in reusing code. Okay, so I'll explain more as we move along with this example. Now, how do you create a function? You start off with the keyword define, and in Python you just have to write def, and following that will be the name of the function. So I'm going to just create a function to print a message, so I'm going to call this print message, and then what you have after that is uh, a pair of brackets. Okay, these brackets are for us to pass in parameters, input parameters to the function. For this first example that I'm going to show you, we're not going to pass in any input parameter, so I'm going to leave this blank, empty, and following that will be a colon, and when you press enter, you'll automatically go one tab in. Okay, now for this function, what I'm going to do is just I'm going to just print a message. So I'm going to say print message from print message function. Okay, so when we see this line, we know that this print came from within this function. Okay, so that's about it. And now I'm going to go to the actual main code. So I'm going to do a print, say start of program. Okay, and after that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this function print message. To call a function, all you need to do is to put in the name of the function, okay, followed by the brackets. If the function requires input parameters, then we pass in input parameters. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this function print message, and that's about it. Okay, so let's run our code now and see what happens. So when we run the module, okay, so we have two print statements. So let's observe this first. So you can see that the function, okay, though it is written as the first line, it doesn't mean it gets executed, okay, the moment the code starts running. Okay, the code starts running from the first line of code that is within this Python file that you have created, and that is this print statement over here. Okay, so that is why I print start of program, and then I call this message called print message, which then brings me to this function, and I execute whatever that is within this function, which is only this particular line. Okay, so you must always remember that the code starts executing from the first line that belongs to this particular Python file, okay, which is not a function. Okay, now the first print statement starts here, and so I start executing from this line onwards, and over here I have a print message which is actually calling this function here. Okay, print message, and when I call this function, what happens is I will jump to this function, execute whatever that is written for this function, all the lines of code, and then come back here. Okay, and since I have nothing else, I will end the program. Okay, so maybe I can do one more print here to say end of program. Okay, and you'll be able to see that a bit clearly now. Okay, so let me save it one more time and run it. Yep, so there you have it. So as you can see, this print message, okay, is called to execute a particular block of code. In this case, the block of code is just to print this line. Okay, and once I finish that block of code, I come back to my main sequence of execution and carry on. Okay, so that is the first example I wanted to show you. Now, the second example I want to show you is creating a function with input parameters. Okay, so for input parameters, you can create a new function here, print message we call it print message input. Okay, and this time I'm going to write this function such that it requires a string or some input parameter to be passed in, but I'm going to take it as a string inside the code that I'm going to write for this function. Okay, so when I call this function, I'm supposed to pass in a parameter which is message. What I do with message is up to me, and that is what I'm going to write now. All I'm going to do is I just want to print the message. Okay, so it could be you could write a function where the input is a string, an integer, or a float. Is up to you. Okay, so in this example I'm showing you that I'm passing in a parameter, and that parameter will then be printed out by the function. Okay, so let's call this function here. So I'm going to call print message input, and this time around I need to make sure I pass in a parameter. Alright, and since I know that I expect the parameter to be a string, I'm going to provide a string. So I'm going to say message passed over. Okay, so this is the message passed over from this particular line to this function here. Okay, so let's save it and run this code here. Yep, so as you can see, the first start of program printout is from here. Then I call a print message function, which prints out a line which is already predefined. In the second, once I finish that, I'll come back to my main execution, and in this third line I call print message input, where I pass in a parameter which is a string which will be printed out by this function. And once that is done, I'll come back to again the main sequence and I print end of program. Okay, so here you can see the modularity, okay, where instead of putting everything in sequence, I can take out blocks of code and put them into separate functions. And I also can see the reusable aspect of functions. Why? Because I can now call the same function, print message input, and pass in another string. Okay, so I can pass in another string here, another message. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so as you can see here, I have called this print message input twice, and each time with different parameters. Okay, so even though right now these functions are only single line functions, they can actually be very comprehensive, doing a lot of important arithmetic or logical operations for your application. So by breaking up your code into modules or functions, you can actually gain a lot, okay, by reusing that same piece of code multiple times through the use of functions. Alright, so I hope this video has given you a good starting point on how functions are used in Python. In my other videos, I'm going to teach you more advanced methods of how functions can be used in terms of passing in other types of variables, as well as getting return values from the functions. Alright, so thank you very much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Thank you. Bye.